I want to catch up on the events of the weekend. And really, there were two main events. Number one, game one of the Stanley Cup Final. Number two, the NHL Combine. But let's be honest, there is one big story coming out of the Stanley Cup Final game one, Edmonton versus Florida. And it was Sergei Bobrovsky, who was the only reason why Florida won game one. Only reason. He was unreal. He makes 32 saves on 32 shots, pulls the shutout. He faces 4.01 expected goals, gives up 0 actual goals. Edmonton controlled that game basically from start to finish. They were the better team from a skater standpoint. One team had a goalie that stood on his head, and one team had a goalie who was just and that was the difference. And unsurprisingly, look, the national story is look how great Sergei Bobrovsky is. Totally warranted. The local story is, oh my God, Sergei Bobrovsky, do you need to jab the knife in even deeper? Because every Flyers fan knows that who was the team that brought Sergei Bobrovsky over to the United States, the NHL in the first place. It sure was the Philadelphia Flyers who signed him as an unrestricted free agent, brought him over from Russia. He spends his first 2 seasons in the NHL with the Flyers, the first as a surprise starting goalie for them in 2010-2011, the second as a backup to Ilya Bryzgalov. I would say the big story, particularly on social media, understandably so, in the Flyers world, was how could they have let this star-level goalie, who is now 35 going on 36 and potentially could be in the midst of leading his team to a Stanley Cup, led them to a Cup final last year. It was one of the big pieces. How could they have let him go? And just going to give a little rundown of what happened.
Yeah.
In terms of Bob and Philly. So Bob gets signed. He not only makes the team out of camp, but he has such a good camp that he ends up being the number 1 goalie on the depth chart to start the season for the Flyers, a team that had just that previous summer gotten to the Cup final, took the Chicago Blackhawks 6 games. Suddenly, you've got a rookie goalie, a 22-year-old rookie, the starting goalie for a team with designs on the Cup. And for the first 3 quarters of that season, I would say that he was a really good starting goalie. Tailed off a little bit at the end. Then the whole thing kind of comes apart in the playoffs. The beginning of game 2, he gives up a weak goal, and Peter Laviolette, as he tended to do, he's a little crazy when it comes to goalies. He basically just gives up on Bob right then and there. It's like, okay, I'm done. This kid just doesn't have it. He's worn down. Maybe he just didn't think he had the mental side of the game down. Decides, okay, I'm going to go goalie crazy. Then we have Brian Boucher comes in. They end up trying Michael Leighton out for a little bit in that Buffalo series. They win the series in spite of goalie craziness. Then against Boston, they get swept. And what happens that summer, famously, is Ed Snider basically goes to them, GM Paul Holmgren, and says, I'm sick of this goalie bullshit. Get me the best goalie on the market. I'm done. We're never doing this again. So Paul Holmgren trades for the rights to Ilya Bryzgalov, and then in order to sign him to a deal that fits under the cap, he signs into a 9-year, $51 million contract, and as that's being announced, also trades away Mike Richards and Jeff Carter, completely reshapes the franchise. Now, that's the big news of the day. They sign Briz, they trade Carter and Richards. The secondary consequence of that, however, is you now have a 31-year-old starting goalie in Ilya Bryzgalov signed through the rest of his 30s. You have a 23-year-old goalie in Sergei Bobrovsky who doesn't want to be a backup. Spends the second year of his entry-level contract as a backup behind Briz. Finishes with an .899 save percentage that season in 29 games as the primary backup. And then apparently, and this is according to the Great Flyers at 50 book that Greenberg did a few years ago. Really good, highly recommend. Basically, Bob's camp went to the Flyers and said, we have 1 more year left on our ELC. If he's just going to be the backup for the rest of his career behind Ilya Bryzgalov, we're not signing another contract with you. We will go back to Russia, and he'll just play in the KHL for the rest of his career. No worries. He has no desire to stay in the NHL as a backup. So, as a result, the Flyers that summer, the summer of 2012, they trade him to the Columbus Blue Jackets for a 2nd-round pick and 2 4th-round picks. The rest is history. That year, Sergei Bobrovsky wins the Vezina in the shortened season in 2012, 2023, or 2013. Ilya Bryzgalov has another bad year. They end up using a compliance buyout on him, and the Flyers lost a goalie who, for the next 10 plus years, is one of the better goalies in hockey. I guess, JP, how did it get to this point where you have a guy in Bob who is young, has shown a ton of talent, and you screw it up so badly that he is threatening to walk away and not re-sign with you to the point where you have to trade him or else you're going to get nothing back for him at the end of that contract?
Well, it's like a panic move, right? And like it felt like a lot of the moves during the early 2010s, there was a lot of panic going on, right? Like you weren't having a lot of success. You know, obviously Snider wanted to win. And that's who he always was, and always wanted to spend money because obviously that's, you want to win, you're going to spend the dough. But you know, Charlie, like, I'm hearing the story, and I'm like trying to go back to that time period, and I'm like thinking to myself, like, well, didn't we all have the same thoughts that Snider in the front office had? Because like obviously that the 2011 playoffs wasn't great, right? You get swept by the Boston Bruins. The goalie position does not look great. So I feel like all of us at the same point, like we felt the same way. Like, let's go all in. Let's go find that goalie. If that's Bryzgalov, it's Bryzgalov. And, you know, a young goalie, you know, just let him go. And I think I felt like the fan base all felt the same way at that time. So it's hard now to look at it because, like, obviously, yeah, it would have been nice to keep Bob.
To have Bob through the entirety of the 2010s and him be the starter. It would have been cool.
He wins the Vezina in his first year with Columbus. So that makes it even worse here. But, like, at that time period, when you're signing Bryzgalov, like, looking back at it, it's hard to say, like, you know, at that time period that, no, we shouldn't have gone for Bryzgalov because of where that goalie position was. I mean, like, I think before that, I mean, like, we had a couple years of Roman Checkmonic, Ron Hextall, I would think, like, before that, where we had, like, consistent goalie play.
Yeah, you had Checkmonic in the pre-lockout. The goalie who was the guy in the beginning of the Holmgren era was Marty Biron. He was fine, but he wasn't a game changer. He was just okay. And they were okay with just okay. Then they go for Ray Emery the year they go to the Cup Final. He gets hurt. You end up having Leighton and Bush. Leighton is a massive surprise in the regular season, obviously, then gives up the awful goal in Game 6 of the Cup Final. But he provides a lot more than you expect. Then, you know, Leighton, I believe, missed most of, if I remember correctly, I believe he missed most of the next season due to injury. Bush is there, but Bob ends up being the guy. I think really what it boils down to is you're right that after that playoff run with all the chaos of it, fans were like, this is ridiculous. I'm sick of this bullshit. We got to figure out the goalie position. This speaks to the flaws of Ed Snider, the owner, where he was at his core a fan. I mean, he ran the team. He was the chairman. He created the team. So he was obviously on a different level of fandom than everyone else. But at heart, he was a fan. And the great parts about that is that it was so obvious how much he cared. He would throw so much money into the team. You know, the passion was unparalleled. There maybe isn't another owner, except for maybe like, I don't know, like peak Yankee Steinbrenner, who cared that much about the team that he owned, the team that he operated. But this was a moment where you needed patience. You needed someone in that front office, or you just needed Snider to be able to look past the anger that fans are completely allowed to just embrace, because that's part of the fun of being a fan, is just completely embracing your emotions. They needed someone in that room to be like, Ed, I know it was frustrating that Bob didn't get the job done in these playoffs, that Labby lost faith in him. I get it. He's 22 going on 23. He's super talented. He's the guy for the future. Don't pull the plug on him yet. And either no one said that to Ed, or no one had the power to get through to Ed and convince him that this was the wrong play, because obviously the Briz signing blows up in their face. He lasts 2 years before they use the compliance buyout on him. It just, to me, I mean, the lesson here is more than anything, and I think the Flyers, maybe they haven't learned it fully, but they've definitely learned it more than they did during the Snider era. You gotta give those young players a chance. You can't just pull the plug and give up on them after one bad playoff run, or, you know, one mediocre season, or one bad second half. Like one guy I'm thinking of here is Joel Farabee. Has a great first half, great first 2/3 of the year, has a bad 1/3 of the final third of the season, and suddenly everybody's like, trade him. Like, Bob is a shining example of why you need to be patient with young guys. And for years, the Flyers weren't. And sometimes it didn't burn them. Sometimes it did. This was a case where that lack of patience burned them because all you needed to do really was give Bob another year or two and it was going to click. The talent was there. It was going to click. And it did. Just didn't click in Philly.
Well, Charlie, look, I think the Bob situation is a good example to learn from because I think right now what we have with our current goalie situation, look, I don't know what we have in Sam Ersson. We talked about it before. I don't know if he's a 1A, 1B, but he's shown me stuff, especially mentally, that he can start in this league. So I think that Bob situation is something that we can learn from with this current goalie situation.
Yeah.
As we're still trying to figure out this room as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because they are going to need to be patient with someone like Ersson. And Ersson's another example where there probably are fans. I would hope not a lot of fans that are watching and listening to the show, but there are fans who watch Ersson struggle over the final month and a half, 2 months of the season and are out on him. Are just like, nope. Kid doesn't have it. Now, does it matter to them that Ersson was running to the ground from a workload standpoint? No. They watched him and they just decided that, this guy sucks. And you know what? Fans have every right to have their opinion about a guy. Like, I'm not saying that that's even a wrong evaluation. Maybe in 10 years, Sam Ersson, we can look back and be like, yeah, he just didn't have it. But that's a fan perspective. If you're running the team, you have to look at things with a wider eye. Mm-hmm. And I think the good thing about Ed Snider was that he was a fan. The bad thing about Ed Snider was that he was a fan. It was two sides of the same coin. Like, you had the great parts of it in that no one could match his passion as an owner. But you also had the negatives where that passion would lead him occasionally to give up on a Sergei Bobrovsky and go all on an Ilya Bryzgalov, who was 31 and never was likely to age particularly well anyway, because he was a 31-year-old goalie that you signed until he was 40. Like, How did you think this contract was going to go? But it was impulsive, driven by frustration of the moment. And that's the kind of stuff that this organization does need to get away from, especially in a cap year. And I think that was one thing that Mr. Snider never fully got. We talked about it on the show, me and Bill especially, about how the pre-Hextall front offices, so post-lockout, so after the salary cap was implemented, but pre-Hextall. Because Hextall was the first one who did truly understand the cap. The idea was like, yeah, they understand there's a cap in concept, but they didn't really understand the implications of it. And I think Snyder still kind of had in his head the mentality of like, well, it doesn't matter if we're giving up on Bob because we'll just go out and buy a goalie. Like, that's what we've always done. We went out and we got Van Beesbrook, and, that's just what we do. They chased down Mike Richter. Like, we'll just throw money at the problem. And the thing is, you can't do that in a cap year. You have to think long-term. You have to plan these things out. And that probably was the last time that Snyder went the full-on reactionary, impulsive route because... And I will always, it ultimately didn't work out, but I'll always give Ed Snider credit on this one, is the fact that when he hired Ron Hextall and Ron Hextall told him, basically, I'm going to do a long-term plan. It's fairly clear that Snyder knew if they did a long-term plan, he was not going to live to see the end of the long-term plan, that he was already sick and there was a good chance that he was not going to live to see the fruits of Hextall's labor. And he was like, you know what? No. I made mistakes by being too impulsive, by thinking too short term. Even if I don't get to see it, this is the right thing for the organization. And yes, Ron Hextall, do a long-term plan that I might not live to see the result of it. I'll always give him credit for that. Now, in retrospect, Ron Hextall probably wasn't the right guy to do it, but I respect that he was willing to take an honest look at his mistakes and say, no, this is a different era. We need to build a team differently. Hextall probably wasn't the right guy to do it. Maybe Danny Briere is, because it looks like Danny Briere is following a similar plan. Again, we'll see if it works. But I do think that the Flyers have learned from the issues that led to them losing Bob.
We all silly like the mayor.